Afternoon, guys. Saturday afternoon after work, and a couple of deliveries came in today, so thought I'd just pop these up and maybe talk about fig cuttings, which I love. I love taking fig cuttings. I love expanding my fig collection, and I got a few figs delivered today, different cuttings, which I'll pot up. Also got this. This is a Brugmansia, sometimes called an angel's trumpet or a devil's trumpet. They're a tropical to subtropical flower. You might have seen them. They have trumpet-shaped flowers that either point to the ground or they point to the sky. I believe the saying goes that if they point to the ground, they're called angels' trumpets, because it's the angels in heaven talking down and taunting the devil. Whereas if they point to the sky, it's the opposite, and it's the devils or demons or whatever goes on in religion, taunting the angels and God and all that sort of stuff. But more importantly, it's an extremely beautiful flower. I've wanted to get one for a while now. There's a couple of reasons that I haven't really grown these before. Number one, these plants, these Brugmansias, are extremely toxic. Some people can use them as a dangerous sort of recreational drug, where if you eat any part of the flower or the seeds, it can be quite hallucinogenic. But it is very, very dangerous, very, very toxic. I'm fairly sure, and I may be wrong, and if I am wrong, I'm very sorry, but I think this is, these Brugmansias are the source of a drug called scolopamine, which is a drug that's used in South America a lot. It's almost a they call it the zombie drug or something similar, where they condense it and they distill it down into a fine powder, and then they'll blow it in the face of the victim, whoever that might be, and they'll kind of lose all sense of inhibition and awareness. It's almost like being hypnotized in a way where they're highly open to suggestion, and if they inhale this drug, they can do as they're told. So the criminal or whoever it might be that's made this drug can tell them, go to your house and empty out all your personal belongings and bring them to me, or empty your bank account, or whatever the case might be. And the people will think it's the best idea in the world and let us go along and do it. There's no sense of kind of, hang on, this is not a really good idea. So not very common, I don't think, outside of South America, but I'm fairly sure that the scolopamine is actually derived from this plant, the Brugmansia. So I don't know, I don't like keeping toxic plants around the house, especially with a young child, but I think it'd be fairly safe in the green tent, and a single plant won't hurt anybody. So yeah, this one arrived today. It's a beautiful orange variety. They grow quite well in pots. They'll flower nicely in pots, and they don't need a lot of space, although they can get quite large if you're in Sydney or Melbourne or other temperate areas. I've seen them in gardens around that block. So excited to add this flower to my collection despite its toxicity. And we'll just give this one a little bit of time to get established over the next couple of weeks. But more importantly, and what I wanted to actually make this video about, is fig cuttings. So as you've seen, if you watch my channel, or if you have any interest in figs and you've come across anything that I put up, I have a fairly decent collection of figs. I've got around 12 to 15 varieties, and I just purchased a couple of more cuttings off of eBay this week, which have arrived today. Now the ones I purchased, I got one called Violet de Soleils, and I got a Black Madeira. But because I ordered them separately from the same seller, he charged me double postage, and as compensation he actually provided here an extra Violet de Bordeaux, which is, if you watch my other videos, one of my favourite figs, the ones that I'm the most interested in trying, and I haven't actually tried a VDB, a Violet de Bordeaux fig yet. So I'm glad that that's kind of been added to my collection here with an extra plant. And fig cuttings and figs in general are one of my favourite types of plants to grow and propagate, because not only are they delicious, they're extremely easy, they're forgiving, they're great plants if you're a beginner and you're just getting into gardening. If you're just getting into propagating figs or plants through cuttings, there's nothing better than to start off with a fig cutting, because it's really hard to screw up. Some of you might know that in work, in my job, I'm a real estate agent, and one of the things that I really love about what I do is I get to see a lot of houses, I get to see a lot of people, and in Canberra we have a great community of Greeks and Italians and French and Croatians and all sorts. And many of these people, when they've come over from whatever country they've come over from, they grow figs natively over there, and there'll be a particular fig that lives in a village that is famous to that village. It's the fig of the village or the area of the region or province or whatever it might be. And so in the backyards of these properties, you can sometimes come across an owner that's had a grandma that came across 60, 70 years ago and has brought across a cutting from the motherland and has passed it along through the family. And these families, you often go to their house and they've got their big established fig tree in the backyard, but they'll take cuttings each year. And often all they do to take their cuttings is they chop it off the tree, they get a pot of soil just from the garden and they whack it in the soil, they chuck it out in the garden, they wait for the rain to come, they water it every now and again, and before you know it they have a fig tree. And it really can be that easy to get a fig tree propagated. So if you've never actually taken or started a tree from cuttings, fig trees are a really good option because of those reasons. It's really easy to get them started. It's very hard to screw them up, provided you give them a bit of water. You can almost do anything with them and you've got a really good chance of them starting. Having said that, when you buy a cutting on eBay, like I bought these cuttings on eBay, this is the Violet de Bordeaux. You can see he's marked VDD on here, VDS for the Violet de Soleil, and BM for the Black Madeira. They cost, this one cutting costs between 45 and 55 bucks. So you don't want to screw it up, and you want to do everything in your power to get it right. And I'm sure that everybody that propagates figs has their own little techniques and methods, and this is what I do. This is how I get my figs started. So first of all, I start with my potting mix that I'm going to use, and I always use for all my plants quite an airy potting mix. It's got some large chunks of bark and perlite, and it's got these expanded clay pellets in there. The idea being that the soil is really airy and really light. But when you're making fig cuttings, I add a whole bunch extra perlite. Now I add about 50%, so a ratio of half of the potting mix and half of the perlite, because the biggest risk you have when starting any cuttings, and fig is no exception, is that if the soil is too wet, then before the roots start, or as the roots start, they'll start to rot and your whole cutting will go. Now before I add the perlites to the soil mix though, I like to give it a bit of a wet down, because perlite is quite dusty, and if you just kind of let it tip it straight in the container, it can be, you get a lot of this powder floating through the air, which is really quite bad to breathe in. So mix this together quite well so we have about a 50-50 mix. This 50-50 mix just adds a lot more air into the propagating mixture, so that when you water it, there's a lot of water in the soil, but there's tons and tons of air pockets, and those air pockets stop pockets of water forming around the base of your cutting, which can then result in rot forming. The next thing I do is I head down to Bunnings and I pick myself up some propagation gel. You can get this in Australia, you get it at Bunnings. This is 3 grams per litre of indole-free butyric acid, and it's just got a little bit of a hormone in there which can help root propagation along the stem. The next thing I do, this is the Violet de Bordeaux. Don't ever mix up don't lose your labels like I do, or else you'll be posting videos on YouTube saying tasting of unknown white fig. So I'll post it to take it to the edge of the container here. Fill this up with soil. I'm using these kind of large, these forest tubes, which are used for like tap-rooted plants and things like that. I'll get my cutting, get my secateurs, Make sure you don't get it up the wrong way, so you can see that the stems on this plant, these are green cuttings by the way, it's still warm over here in Australia. When these cuttings were taken off the plant, these would have had leaves on it. The guy who sold it had stripped all the leaves off, and you can plant fig cuttings when they're green, when they're dormant, when they're young wood, softwood, hardwood. Figs are extremely resilient. But what I do is I always take off the bottom so that there is a new cut. There's a fresh scar at the bottom before I plant it. I'll also get my secateurs or knife and I'll scrape along the stem. You don't have to do too much, I'll just make a few nicks. I don't know if this camera will pick that up. A few green nicks in here, and then I'll also kind of just give it a couple of slashes around just to really kind of give it some scar tissue on there. Now if you do that, there is a risk that these wounds will become infected. If there's any bacteria in the soil, any fungus that can attack the wood, and your plant can rot and die. I haven't had that problem. Figs, as I say, fairly resilient. I give it a good dunk in a hormone and then I let it drip down the stem a little bit because my hands are already filthy in my potting. I'll rub that along the stem here. The roots can form at the node, so for instance this node where this branch was previously, the roots can form along the wounds that I formed. And then simply get your stick and dunk it in your soil. You don't have to be gentle, not at this stage, there's no roots to worry about, it's just a stick. Top it up with a bit more soil, and there we have it, one fig cutting. This one here is a Violet de Soleil. My French is pretty rusty, but I think that means violet of the sun or something along those lines. Maybe Soleil is a town or a province. Put my label on the pot. Get my secateurs. Make sure that the plant is facing the right direction. You can also see on this plant there's several buds on here, on this stick here. Some of these might even be braver figs, which if they start forming will cut off. Cut the base off again, scar it. Into our hormone. If you've been watching my videos of tastings that I've been doing recently of figs, all of the plants that I'm tasting from were cuttings, and they're not even 2 years old, those fruiting cuttings. So you can go from having a stick like this to having a fruiting plant within 12 months. You can take figs off them. So if you were to grow a fig, or basically any fruit from the seed, it can take years and years and years before you can ever see any sort of productive fruit off the plant. But when you take it from a plant like this, a cutting that's already fruiting, that cutting remembers in a way how old it already is. It remembers that it's fruiting. It starts life as a mature cutting, and provided it can develop the root system quick enough during its initial kind of months and years of life, it will quite happily fruit for you in that first year. Some people would say that it's not a good idea to allow them to fruit in the first year, that they're just not mature enough and they can't support it, and you're sacrificing plant and root growth to do that. I don't know, I'm not so worried about it, I think it's fine. I let them fruit if they want to fruit. If they fruit don't mature because the plant's not old enough, that's fine as well. Then yes, if the plant's wasted a bit of energy and time trying to produce fruits that can't ripen, but at the same time maybe you get a delicious fruit off it. Maybe you get to try a new variety of fig or whatever it is you're taking cuttings of. Now when you are taking cuttings, if you are new to this, not all plants will be as easy to start as fig trees. Fig trees are amongst the very, very easiest. Other plants that are very, very easy to start are plants like blackberries, raspberries, mulberries, even though you've got different families, but the mulberries are quite easy to start from. Many flowering plants that are out there you can start quite easily from cuttings. Things like these dragon fruits here are extremely easy to start from cuttings. Not every plant it's possible, but a good majority are, and some will need a lot of care, some will need very little care. But if you're going to get started, you've never done this before, it's your first shot getting anything started for cuttings, I would highly recommend figs as a good starting plant. So once you've got your 3 cuttings in there, cuttings don't need any light to start with. So cuttings are, they've got no leaves on it, they're using the energy that's stored in the stem, so there'll be carbohydrates that have already been stored from the leaves and the plant before the cuttings were taken. And those carbohydrates will be used to fuel the root development, the initial leaf development of the plants, and until those leaves form, these plants can't photosynthesize any light at all. And in fact, if you expose them to too much light at this stage, you risk the soil drying out, and if the soil dries out, it will kill any newly developing roots fairly quickly. And in fact, the biggest risk you have with your new fruit cuttings or fig cuttings or whatever it is that you're trying to start is if you don't keep them moist, without being too moist, and the roots start to develop and the roots die, that's probably the end of your cutting. So put them in a nice warm place. They need to be warm enough to be able to fuel the cell division to get all the root development and things started. But don't put it somewhere that's so bright and hot that the soil dries out. I'm just going to put them down, hidden in here. You don't want them anywhere where the soil is too hot. The soil dries out and kills off those roots. Similarly, you don't want to put them in a place where they're going to be soaking wet. You don't want it under a tap or something like that that's going to be dripping all the time. You don't necessarily want it out in the open, at least in my opinion, because if it rains too much, they can rot. I think a really good position is you can even keep it in the dark at the initial stage on a heat mat, inside a cupboard or a grow tent like this, or on a warm windowsill, or above the heater, the dryer, in the laundry, anywhere like that's a really good place to get these kind of cuttings started. And what you'll find in the first couple of weeks is they'll do very, very little. You can't actually see the root development. Often I like to start my fig cuttings in a clear plastic cup so that once the roots start, you'll be able to see them as they kind of touch and reach the end of the cup, and you know that something's happening. And it can take 3 to 4 to 5 weeks for that to start happening. In a black pot like this, you need to have a little bit more faith that it's just happening. Keep an eye on the cutting itself. If the cutting starts to fail, what will happen is the wood will start to shrivel up and go dry looking, a bit like a dead stick, and that'll be the end of that. But as long as it's looking like it's got a bit of green in it, the top will callus over from where the guy cut the initial cutting, but it will be quite evident that the cuttings are still alive. Eventually the buds on the cutting will swell, they'll start to form new leaves, and as those new leaves come on, you can then move them into a sunny place or a bright lit place like this, so that you can then move them on to start growing the next stage of a fig tree. And I do have one that I started a while ago. This fig here was started from the fig that I had in the front yard. Now when I took this cutting, I actually thought this was a Violette, a Saint Dominique's Violette. This is the one that I did a tasting of the other day that turned out to be a white fig of some description. So this is that white fig. And you can see that as it's come on and as the cuttings developed, and this is very thin cutting, that it started to put new leaves on, and this plant, just like the mother plant, will probably end up fruiting within 12 months. So just a little bit of a video for you guys, and once they are at this stage they do need to get some good light, so I will put it back in its position. Give my Brugmansia a water as well. And that's it. Fig cuttings. I know that for most of the guys that watch my channel, you've probably taken a million cuttings in your lives, and this isn't going to be the most interesting video you've ever watched. But if you are new and you have been wondering what to do if you want to get some cuttings started, well, this is exactly how I do it, and if you had any luck or failures, do let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.